My name is Khalil.
Admittedly.
Welcome everybody to the summer lecture series, and welcome to everybody on the call as well. To start, we're going to have a video that Btool has made about her presentation on USA Women's Rugby Sevens non-contact injury risk factors. She's from Loughborough University and Olympic Preparation Center Jordan Olympic Committee. So Kiara's going to share this video.
I'd like to start off by thanking Dr. Lopez and Megan for inviting me to present today at the summer lecture series. So I'm going to be presenting research on USA Women's Rugby Sevens injury risk factors. The research was completed last year, and I had the opportunity to present it at the Women in Sport and Exercise Conference in London in June of 2019. The title of today's presentation is USA Women's Rugby Sevens non-contact injury risk factors. To begin, I'd like to announce that I have nothing to disclose. Quick background. As we all know, rugby participation is increasing rapidly worldwide. There are approximately 9.1 million registered rugby players, and over a quarter of these players are female, which brings the total number of female players to 2.7 million worldwide, according to a 2019 statistic. In the United States, rugby is one of the fastest growing sports, and the number of players is estimated to be 1.53 million, which is a 17.5 times increase from 2010. The rate of growth of rugby in the US is approximately 300,000 new players per year. The emphasis of this study and this presentation is on injury risk factors in women affiliated with US rugby. Despite the tremendous growth of rugby, there is still little data on rugby sevens from an injury epidemiology perspective, especially in women's rugby sevens. Having injury data will be beneficial, especially considering the high injury rate among international women's competitions, represented by an incidence range of from 95.4 to 188 injuries per 1,000 player hours. In rugby sevens, female athletes may be at a higher risk of contact and non-contact injuries. When comparing between contact and non-contact injuries, according to player position, non-contact injuries were shown to be the most severe types of injuries amongst backs, with a severity of 69.4 days lost compared to 40.5 days lost from contact injuries. So to further understand the discrepancy between contact and non-contact injuries in women's rugby sevens, and to understand overall injury epidemiology in women's sevens, the aim of the study was to describe non-contact injury incidence and risk factors among developing and emerging US women's rugby sevens. Match injury data were collected prospectively by trained research data collectors. The study population consisted of 10,328 under 19 to elite US female players from 2010 to 2015. Data was collected from 1,895 multi-division matches among 80 USA tournaments to calculate exposure expressed in player match hours. The exposure in this study was 6,285.1 player hours. Incidents per 1,000 player hours and mechanisms of injuries were captured by the Rugby Injury Survey, an evaluation tool known as the RISE report. Injury definitions and methodology conformed with international rugby injury research consensus. There are some important definitions. First of all, match injury rates are expressed per 1,000 player match hours. An injury is defined as any physical complaint caused by the transfer of energy that exceeds the body's ability to maintain its structural and/or functional integrity. There are two types of injuries. The first one being medical attention injuries, which is an injury that results in no absence from play. And we have time loss injuries, which are injuries that do not permit a player to return to play the day of injury. Severity is defined as the days absent before return to sport, whether it be training or competition. So injury severity is determined by post-tournament follow-up with the injured athlete. Non-contact mechanisms are defined as no contact with an opposing player or collision type mechanism. There are two types of non-contact mechanisms. The first one is classic non-contact. Classic non-contact injuries occurred while in play, and they are accidents with no foreseeable way to prevent the injury. For example, cutting, changing direction, or sprinting. The other type of non-contact injury mechanism is other non-contact. These injuries are influenced by another factor that is not related to match play. For example, excessive celebration, slips or trips off or around the pitch. Overall, there were 167 non-contact injuries, which accounted for 29% of the total injuries, resulting in an injury incidence of 26.5 per 1,000 player hours. In terms of time loss injuries, there were 44 time loss injuries, which is represented by an injury incidence of 7 per 1,000 player hours. Medical attention injuries were 123, with an injury incidence of 19.6 per 1,000 player hours. When looking at the type of non-contact injuries, classic non-contact injuries accounted for the overwhelming majority of injuries with 92%, whereas other non-contact injuries counted for only 8% of the total injuries. And the difference between the two was significantly different. In overall non-contact injuries, there was no significant difference between playing positions. Incidence of injuries in backs was 23.9 per 1,000 player hours, while incidence in forwards was 19.3 per 1,000 player hours. Further, there was no significant difference between positions in classic non-contact time loss injuries, with backs having an incidence of 6.1 per 1,000 player hours and forwards 5.9 per 1,000 player hours. Classic non-contact injuries resulted in 58 days lost, and other non-contact injuries resulted in 60 days lost. The mean severity of time loss injuries was 58.4 days. When comparing males to female athletes, there was no difference in time loss in number of days lost for the injuries, with a mean of 35.4 days time loss. There were also no differences between males and females for time loss injury incidence by playing position. The most commonly injured body region due to non-contact injuries were the lower extremities, followed by the upper extremities, and then the head and neck. When looking at the proportion of non-contact injuries and body system among US women's rugby sevens, the joint or ligament and muscle or tendon were the most commonly injured systems. They accounted for 71% of total injuries. The 5 most commonly injured body parts overall were the knee, the ankles, the shoulder, the anterior thigh or quads, and hands or fingers. Of the top 2 injuries, the knees were more commonly injured than ankles. Knee injuries accounted for 23% of injuries, while ankles accounted for 17% of injuries. When looking at the proportion of non-contact injuries and phase of play, the most common phases of play where non-contact injuries occurred were during running or open play, followed by pre- and post-tackle. Further, 21.6% of the injuries that occurred during phases of play that were not well defined, and hence categorized into the unable to define section. Practical implications. This study is the first to analyze injury incidents and mechanisms in the new format of Rugby Sevens in a developing rugby population. US women's Rugby Sevens players sustained a greater proportion of non-contact injuries compared to elite international Rugby Sevens players. In the Rio 2016 Olympic Games, women sustained 16.7% non-contact injuries from overall injuries, while men had 22.2% of their injuries were due to non-contact injuries. In this study, the non-contact injuries accounted for 29% of the overall injuries, and they accounted for 26.3% of time loss injuries. In US amateur play, in both men and women, non-contact injuries accounted for 26.1% of total injuries, and in US amateur women alone, non-contact injuries accounted for 33% of total injuries. This study raises a concern for the high risk of injury associated with non-contact in women's rugby sevens, specifically the pre-contact or eluding tackle phase, which is quite a new skill for US women's players. The increased amount of running open play, sidestepping, deceleration, and acceleration increases the risk of non-contact injuries in open play and will need further evaluation for injury prevention. Understanding injury mechanisms in this new format of sport will aid in the sport's injury prevention cascade. In addition to lower extremity injuries, the high frequency of head or neck, shoulder, and upper extremity injuries attributed to this new skill of tackling in the US cohort implies the need to address breakfall training techniques specific for women, including a focus on safe landing while tripping or falling or being tackled. Increasing muscular load tolerance and proprioception during training and including open field maneuvers like change of direction may help reduce the risk of lower extremity soft tissue and ligamentous injuries associated with non-contact mechanisms. These training programs could help with the sudden stops and abrupt changes in directions encountered in Rugby Sevens. Rugby Sevens multi-game tournament fixture and format is another area for further investigation. Rugby Sevens has the potential to reduce neuromuscular function and inhibit a player's full recovery by the start of the next competition, which is relevant given that multiple games are played per tournament day. This emphasizes that preseason and in-season conditioning and the tournament demands must be balanced to avoid overtraining and also improve and enhance appropriate in-season conditioning. So that's it for me today. Thank you to everyone for listening. And thank you to the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group for having me here today. To everyone, have a great summer and stay safe.
Well, that was great. We were very fortunate to be invited to the women's sport over there in London to present this at St. Mary's out of Twickenham. I mean, I'm uncertain if everyone on the call is really aware of how important or pinnacle St. Mary's University is in regards to Twickenham, and that all the national teams actually practice there during the Rugby World Cups when they have them there, or even visiting teams when they are at Twickenham playing opposing teams there, the national English squad or the local London squads. They actually practice there, and they have a great sports program out of St. Mary's. But to go back to the topic, I think the importance here is a good translation into what we were talking about last week with Dr. Ma on ACL injuries, as well as now what Dr. Biagad can bring in, and that is the demands of female athletes are definitely different, as Dr. Ma brought up last week, compared to male players, let alone with the sudden stops, the runs, the sprinting, the support for need of training, conditioning, like to meet the women's rugby sevens demands. And I think this is very unique because it has not been addressed. Excuse me. It has not, excuse me, it hasn't been addressed yet. Excuse me. So I think the high rates of joint and ligament injuries, particularly against our female population, reflect a knee and ankle concerns that maybe Dr. Biergard could bring about with ACL rehabilitations.